Good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to be here at this conference. I always wanted to be at the 1997 event. I read about it, I heard people talking about it, and it was always one of those things that would have been a fantastic thing to experience at that point in my career. So it's great to be here 20 years on and to be part of what looks like it's going to be an equally invigorating and exciting event. So, having looked back, we're now going to look forward. And when we do either of those things, we also talk about the present day, but particularly we want to encourage our discussion to be thinking sort of perhaps pessimistically, perhaps optimistically about where we might be going and the types of research we need to do, the types of activism we would like to see, and the type of substance to future environmental justice that we think is on the horizon. And we have three fantastic panelists to help us in that process, which I will introduce in turn. And we're going to have a similar format, so we'll have 10 minutes contribution from each person. I've encouraged them to keep it short and pithy and tight. I've also encouraged them to disagree with each other if they feel so inclined. And I like the sofa bit, so I think we want to have more sofa in this session. So they're going to be able to lounge on the sofa, but I'm also going to do what I can to bring you as members of the audience in. So we have a conversation which is both on the sofa and in the room more generally. So, first of all, we have Professor Julian Agyeman, who is Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University, just outside of Boston. Julian actually started his academic career in the UK. I first met him when he was over that side of the Atlantic. He then moved across the Atlantic into the United States, and he's developed a fantastic and extensive scholarship on the intersections between environmental justice and sustainability, particularly captured in the notion of just sustainability, which he's taken forward and other people are now working with in very interesting ways, but also work on sharing and the sharing cities in the context of just sustainability. So, Julian, do you want to come up and give us your thoughts on the future?
I'm really shocked that my academic colleagues haven't been selling books. So the psychologists tell me if I leave these books up here for 45 seconds, 20% of you will buy either one or both of them. So I'm pleased about that. The reason for putting the books up here is several-fold. Firstly, the one on the left is from 2003, and then the one on the right is from 2015. It represents 15 years of thinking about this concept of just sustainabilities. But before I actually start, I actually want to pay my tribute to the second editor in the book, Professor Bob Bullard. Bob and I started corresponding before the internet, and you millennials, there was a period before the internet. We actually wrote letters to each other in the 80s when I was in Britain trying to get this idea of environmental justice into Margaret Thatcher's Britain. I mean, Thatcher didn't care about green issues, and to think there were black people talking about green issues, I mean, we were, you probably thought I was crazy as well, Bob. I mean, I'm pretty sure of that. So what I want to try and do, and in 10 minutes, we cannot be comprehensive, so I want to give you just 3 ideas, I think, about this idea of just sustainabilities. But one of the things I just want to make very clear is this is not a competitor concept to environmental justice. I'm a professor of urban policy and planning. I noticed from the early 2000s in the United States that the concept of environmental justice was a very powerful concept as an activist agenda, but they were pushing it out at the state and other levels. They were pushing it out of the policy agenda. The new policy agenda then was sustainability. So I was thinking, and in this book we were trying to think about, how do we get the justice of environmental justice into sustainability? And so we got this concept called just sustainabilities. And I'm pleased to say, I think, judging by the number of requests I get from young PhD researchers and from policymakers, this is a concept that I think has got some traction. So I want to speak a little bit about 3 areas that I see of growing importance. Now, being in urban planning, one of the key things that's really impressed me over several years is this definition by Patsy Healy, Emeritus Professor at Newcastle, that urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. 2 fabulous concepts, coexistence and shared space. Coexistence and shared space. This isn't coexistence and shared space with everybody who looks alike. We live in increasingly different and diverse cities. We live in intercultural cities. We now have the concept of hyperdiversity. How do we plan for, how do we move forward in cities of difference? How do we coexist in shared space? Because this is the nub of just sustainabilities and environmental justice. Whether you take the space as being the local, whatever that means, or the global, we coexist in this shared space. This is the challenge of our times. And so I think, and I don't usually advertise other people's books, but I'm going to advertise this one. I think there's 3 challenges then. Number 1 is recognizing, and we've mentioned it, and to us in this room, we are absolutely convinced and always have been that human equality and environmental quality are inseparable. But there are still people who don't believe this. We are constantly under challenge to prove. I think this book does a really good job of making the link between environmental quality and human equality. So basically, the spirit level. 40 years of data across the world shows one big thing. It's not poverty, it's inequality that is corrosive in society. Poverty is bad, but inequality is really bad. And the bigger the gap between rich and poor, the more problems you have in your society. Absolute correlation. But cut to the chase here, in terms of, let me just go back to that. What was really interesting about the research, they showed that basically the gap between rich and poor, the bigger the gap, obviously the more social problems, from everything from teen pregnancy to drug taking to incarceration rates on every level. But also they found a correlation between increasing inequality and advertising revenues. Advertisers love inequality. Inequality sells products like nothing. So the states with the biggest inequality, the countries with the biggest inequality, massive advertising revenues. But the book makes the point that inequality heightens competitive consumption, keeping up with the Joneses. The more inequality, the more people spend, buy on credit, whatever. And inequality heightens competitive consumption. Consumption heightens our carbon footprint. So this book makes the case that inequality is what drives climate change. Now, a lot of the evidence that I see says inequality will worsen climate change, but I don't see much saying inequality is the cause of climate change. So inequality and climate change, I think, are inextricably linked. And if we really want to understand, I think, sustainability and justice, we need to look at this nexus between inequality as a driver and a deepener of climate change and inequality together. So I think then recognition of this idea of human equality and environmental equality to us on the political left, to us as environmental justice activists and scholars, it's a case well made, but still a lot of people are challenging that. And I think one of the issues going forward is to keep that inequality and environmental quality and human inequality issue alive. I'm always saying to my urban planning students, ask not what is probable, but what is possible. And I think that's a case, again, for what we want in the next generation of environmental justice scholarship. We need to move to look about what is possible. We will never get out of this tired old paradigm if we keep doing what we've already done. And here you have 2 pictures. This is Times Square and Broadway in New York. Who would ever thought we would see pictures like this? Who would ever thought, a woman would be sitting there in the red red clothing, looking as if it's the most normal thing to be doing, sitting on a deck chair in the middle of Times Square. The young woman blissed out in the moment of transgression. But let's go behind this picture. Mayor Bloomberg hired an amazing transportation commissioner, Janet Sadiq Khan, who hired Jan Gehl, the architect of the Copenhagen miracle. And together they enlisted the transportation justice, the environmental justice, the other groups in New York who wanted to see streets for people. And this is the result, 10 years on. Now, Mayor Bloomberg did all kinds of things that I don't agree with. But one thing that he did do was really give people an idea of what is possible in terms of the streets of New York. And this is, I think, certainly in terms of urban planning, where I'd like to see some of the activism and some of the future possibilities for environmental justice and just sustainability's research and activism. And third, I think this idea of questioning. We have so many concepts in sustainability. One is local and one is less. You know, local is a big thing in sustainability, and I'm going to talk about that. And the idea of less is more. I remember being at a conference in 1988 when we set up the Black Environment Network in Britain, and Jonathan Porritt, who was the founder, well, the director of Friends of the Earth in the UK at the time, said to the other keynote speaker, the Reverend Barry Thorley, who was a black minister in one of the churches in the UK, he said, you know, well, we've got to start consuming less. And Barry Thorley turned around and said to Jonathan Porritt, Jonathan, my people can't consume any less. Don't tell me to consume less. When we've consumed what you've consumed, then maybe we'll think about that. But I want another 100 years of consumption before I start consuming less. So there's this notion of less, I think, is very, very damaging. But I just wanted to spend the last minute talking about the word local. What are local foods in an intercultural society? Here, oh my God, sorry about this. Technology is not too good here in Sydney, is it? Usually we have things right in front of us. This is George and Julia Bowling from the Bowling Farm in Maryland. They're tobacco farmers, but not now. Now, the signpost to their farm is that, African produce. There's 140,000 Africans in the DC area. They want to eat African food that is grown locally. George and Julia Bowling are one of a group of farmers starting to provide that food. Great idea. What is local food in an intercultural society? The Filipinos in San Diego believe that their food is local because they grow it and they farm it. The farmers in the greater Vancouver region, 20% of whom are Chinese Canadians, believe their food is local food. Is local geographic or is it a cultural? Can we have a translocalism? And I think this is a challenge. We need to keep challenging some of the dogma, local, less. All of these ideas are up for grabs, and I think we really need to look at them. And if we are going to have a local foods movement, let's make that local foods movement think more translocally. And I'm really frightened that Duncan's going to do me damage, so I'm going to stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. I've never had such an effect from just standing up before. That was awesome. Okay, so next up, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Alice Ma, who is a research fellow in sociology at the University of Warwick. She's had an academic career that's moved her from Canada to the UK and out to Germany and then back to the UK again. And in the UK, she's leading a fantastic 5-year project funded by the European Research Commission called Expertise, Environmental Justice in the Petrochemical Industry. And she's been holding some great events and putting together a newsletter, which I'd thoroughly recommend people subscribe to. She has a great team of people working with her. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much for the invitation, David, and for the introduction. It's a great privilege and honor to be here in such fantastic company. So I'm going to be talking about the challenge of global environmental injustice. So as many of you are aware, one of the main aims of environmental justice has been to make injustices visible. And so much of this effort has been focused on activism, on conflict, on protests, on these struggles for justice. But the main aim has been about tackling injustice. And I think it's important to think about the context of injustice as not just bracketed within an ideal aim of justice, but more about also thinking about contexts where injustice is not so visible. So where there's no activist movements, where there's no media attention, where there are maybe complaints or felt injustices. And as Rob Nixon has pointed out in his work on slow violence, this is actually the case of the majority of contexts of environmental injustice around the world. So the project that I've been working on is looking at the global petrochemical industry around the world with contexts in China, in the United States, in Europe, and more broadly, very much following that environmental justice framework in the sense of looking at inequality and the disproportionate burden on poor and more marginalized people. But our methodology has been to focus on contexts of injustice where there are more kind of quiet cases. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing in China. As many of you may be aware, probably one of the most visible examples of environmental justice or environmental activism in China has been the growth of the anti-PX or anti-paraxylene protests, these mass protests that have been like 500,000 people that started in Xiamen in 2007 and have been gathering pace. There's ones every several months. This image is from Kunming in 2013, although there have been crackdowns on these kinds of protests more recently. So that's where a lot of the kind of popular exposure is to thinking about environmental protest or conflict or justice concerns. But many scholars have also pointed out that actually these are mostly urban middle-class movements that are not in the most severe areas of environmental injustice in China, which are actually more in the rural areas. So in 2010, the journalist Deng Feng and a study by Li Liao in 2010 mapped cancer villages in China, so identified areas that had disproportionate levels of cancer and illnesses, and made this map that got all over the media and exerted such pressure that actually the Chinese government officially admitted that they have cancer villages in China in 2013 and started to implement policies. Anna Laura Wainwright, the anthropologist, has written a fabulous book called Resigned Activism, in which she talks about the conditions in rural China and these cancer villages, and about how many of these contexts, including in her study, were not cases where there were a lot of activism, but actually places where people had much more everyday experiences of living and fighting for better environments, but never really escalated to the sense of an environmental justice battle. So some of the research that we've been doing has been focusing on Nanjing. Now, Nanjing is a city that has not experienced any of these massive struggles, but it hosts the second largest petrochemical base in all of China, and the entire city is dangerously encircled by chemical factories on all sides. It's surrounded by valleys. And the local government has declared that this is actually quite a dangerous situation to be encircled by all these petrochemical and chemical facilities. And they've tried to locate everything to the north in a chemical park. And there have been numerous accidents, there have been numerous scientific studies about the health consequences, the risks, but there haven't been very many protests. So we've been doing some research, and some of these quotes that you see up here are quite typical of the residents and workers in the area. It's sort of like, what can we do? We know that there are health problems. We found that there are reports of high levels of cancer. Almost everybody has got nasitis. Workers are encouraged to retire early at 40 and go on retreats so that they can get out of the toxic air for a bit. It's very widely recognized. And the people who suffer the most are actually migrant laborers who live in this sort of liminal zone right next to the factories in a part that's declared illegal for people to live in. But nonetheless, since they're not sort of citizen residents, then they don't have that status. So these are some of the dimensions of environmental injustice in China. And we've also done some research about indigenous or local language use of environmental justice as a concept in China, which is not at all in the civil society sphere, but is slowly being taken up within the Chinese language in some journals, and trying to see to what extent the US-based concept applies, and emphasizing some of the differences, like the importance of rural dimensions and east-west divisions. This is a visit to the petrochemical park, one of the major companies, Sinopec, welcoming with their sort of corporate social responsibility slogan about how green they are, how intelligent they are. And so they do kind of echo many of the global trends in this regard. And you can see this person running around, the lighting isn't great, but there's a person running around a sports track right beside the petrochemical facility, so it is a really proximate neighborhood. And just to bring it more close to home, I mean, I'm Canadian, but live in the UK, and probably the closest facility of this sort is Foley Petrochemical Plant near Southampton. And this is an area that's also a quiet case, you'd say. Almost nobody's heard of it outside of the UK. There have been no environmental justice struggles. When I first visited, talking to local residents, they say it's all fine. You can't find a lot in the media. But if you dig a little deeper, there have been some massive industrial accidents around 2007. There's been a long history of covering up controversies, complaints of illnesses. It was declared a pollution zone, and there's sort of a fracturing social compact between the industry and the community, whereby a lot of these issues are becoming exposed. But on the ground, there's no sort of strong activism. So this is something that we've been following and thinking about in terms of what that means. And also following patterns of environmental justice or injustice in the sense of being relatively poor and but not ethnic minority communities. Thank you. So I think in considering environmental injustice, it's important to think about diversifying our methods, so thinking about new alliances, new ways, thinking about conversations like in this forum around the globe, about different contexts, about ethnographic methods as well as activist methods, and joining up conversations, but also thinking about maybe slower ecologies or attentions to things that unfold at a pace that's not so rapid, that's less strikingly visible. And thinking about different scales, so the global, the local, and the national levels, but also scales in the sense of the scales of justice. I mean, it was mentioned earlier, this idea of values that people hold dear to in terms of justice, but there's no one sense of justice. There's really strong conflicts between the environment, people's homes, people's jobs, I mean, it's not like there's one kind of homogenous idea of what environmental justice is. And so I think attending to those sorts of values is an important thing to pay attention to. Thank you.
Great. It's building up to a good sofa session in a minute, but before we get there, we have David Pellow, who is Professor of the Dyson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So David has written widely and influentially about environmental justice, and in particular environmental justice as a social movement, as well as serving on the boards of directors of many different initiatives, community-based, national and international organizations dedicated to progressing environmental justice in a diversity of contexts and settings. So a wealth of experience to draw on, and 10 minutes on the future, David.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the conference organizers. It's a real pleasure to be here. And in the spirit of recognizing First and Aboriginal nations, I bring you greetings from occupied native Chumash lands, also known as Santa Barbara, California. I want to begin with a story about a man named Bryant Arroyo. Bryant Arroyo is a Puerto Rican man who has served time in a prison in the state of Pennsylvania. Bryant Arroyo also is known because he organized more than 900 of his fellow inmates to write letters to the nearby town supervisors in which this prison is based, protesting the planned construction of an $800 million coal gasification plant next door. The coal plant project was defeated, earning Bryant Arroyo, a prisoner, the title of jailhouse environmentalist. Now, he is one of just many people in the United States who has fought against environmental injustices under the unimaginable conditions and brutality of the prison industrial complex in my country. And so in this talk, thinking about looking forward with respect to environmental justice research, I want to discuss conditions facing people like Mr. Arroyo to consider the utility of what has been called a critical environmental justice studies framework. Critical EJ studies is an idea that people have put forth going back at least till 2005, intended to address some of the limitations and tensions within the literature. I recently began a project where I'm bringing this perspective to light and trying to apply it to the intersection between the prison system and environmental justice concerns. There are many, many ways in which prisons and environmental issues intersect to produce harms to the bodies of inmates, corrections officers, and more than humans in nearby ecosystems and land bases. For example, there are confirmed reports of water contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other pollutants at prisons in more than 20 states in the United States, including the now infamous case of Flint, Michigan, which is in the heart of Genesee County, where we have a jail where many inmates, including pregnant women, were forced to drink contaminated water while the corrections officers, the prison guards, looked on while drinking from filtered water out of bottles. The Northwest Detention Center in the Seattle, Washington area is a privately operated prison designed to house more than 1,500 immigrant detainees. This gets you a sense of the global scale here, people from all over the world, and is directly adjacent to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. So a classic EJ studies approach to this topic would likely place a primary emphasis on the degree to which there may be geographic concentrations of prisons and jails next to various communities and neighborhoods, and what remedies must be sought through state-based policy mechanisms. And so I want to build on that with a critical EJ studies approach to just go a bit further. The first pillar of that approach really opens up our scale of analysis to consider how multiple social categories of difference are intertwined in the making of and resistance to environmental injustice. Let's talk about gender, race, and class. The U.S. prison system, as we may know, is comprised by a majority of people of color and a majority of non-white people and people who are low income. And today, women constitute the single fastest growing group of prisoners. All of these groups face great risk as a result of a range of environmental threats being generated both inside and outside of the prisons. So the point is all of these categories matter. Let's talk about species and ecosystems. The impacts of prisons on ecosystems include the ways in which, for example, sewage and other water discharges a whole host of chemical toxins, fossil fuels, air pollution, and hazardous waste generated from within U.S. prison systems affect non-human species and communities in waterways, ambient air, and nearby land bases. One campaign I'm working on is in Letcher County, Kentucky. It's in the southern United States. It's the site of a proposed prison project that will be placed on land that is now cleared because there once were mountains there. Those mountains are no longer there because coal companies engaged in MTR, mountaintop removal, which is a violent, destructive practice of blowing up mountains to extract coal, reducing ecosystems to poisonous rubble and dust. This prison is also to be placed on an area that is low income, raising clear environmental justice concerns about multiple and layered uses over time that will produce harm to ecosystems and human health. The Letcher County prison site is also home to second growth forests. Second growth forests that serve as habitats for 71 different known species, including the endangered species of the Indiana bat and the gray bat, whose lives and fate will be placed in further jeopardy as a result of this proposal. Alice Ma just mentioned the importance of multiscalar analysis. Temporal scales is the second pillar of the critical environmental justice framework, and this figures quite strongly in any study of prisons in the United States because you've got to pay attention to history. There's been a lot of talk about our 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution because it's become a key site of discussion for the relationship between imprisonment and oppression, because that document, if you read it very closely, makes quite clear that prisons are legally sanctioned sites of enslavement as quote-unquote punishment for a crime. Thus, many scholars, myself included, would argue that abolishing the prison system as we know it today is an important and uncompleted, unfinished bit of business that was begun with the work of slavery abolition centuries ago. So let's continue with scale, talk about micro scale. Petra talked about the importance of the emphasis on the body. Extremely important focus out of feminist scholarship in particular, and feminist environmental justice scholarship as well. Rachel Stein and some of her work, Sherry Moraga and others, have argued, as Petra did, when we redefine our bodies as homes, as lands, as environments, then we can more effectively personalize and therefore politicize the fact that so many of us have our well-being put at risk from a range of threats. At the micro scale and in the prison system, we find that study after study finds that LGBTQ folk and women face extraordinarily high threats of sexual abuse and violence in that prison system. This is not reformable. It is endemic to prisons. Moreover, consider the deliberate use of toxins on prisoners' bodies. I call these chemical attacks at the micro scale. In many U.S. jails and prisons, according to a recent study by Human Rights Watch, we find that inmates with mental disabilities are frequently subjected to punishment and pain compliance techniques that include the use of chemical sprays to the eyes, to the body, etc. So sexual abuse and chemical attacks, I would argue, are clear examples of environmental injustice in prisons. Let's jump up to the macro scale. We find that many prisons in the U.S. are located on or nearby former military waste dumps. For example, in my home state of California, we have the Victorville Federal Correctional Complex, which was built on what is known as a former weapons storage area. It is now a military Superfund site. Means it is recognized by the federal government as contaminated land that poses a significant threat to human and/or environmental health. That prison complex is built on the site of the George Air Force Base, where that base was once located and where the Department of Defense once buried and stored radioactive nuclear waste, creosote, tetraethyl lead, and munitions. I spoke recently to Eric McDavid, who's a famous environmentalist and former political prisoner who did time at that site. He told me, quote, "I served time at that facility in Victorville. It's on a Superfund site. The water is contaminated. It's what you shower with, it's what you eat with, it's what you drink," end quote. So, the at-risk bodies of prisoners at Victorville are linked to the legacy of bodies at this Air Force base and the employees and devastated bodies of indigenous peoples and non-humans who have been sacrificed or compromised in the global nuclear arms race and the Cold War. The third pillar of EJ Studies signals an opportunity to think and act in ways that question our reliance on state dominance to imagine and achieve environmental injustice. A particularly pronounced way in which prisons and environmental justice come together is through the methods that the state often employs to criminalize, control, and incarcerate people who take measures to defend and quote-unquote save the environment and non-humans. In recent years, this has been called the Green Scare, which includes surveillance, infiltration, intimidation, harassment, and imprisonment of activists in radical environmental movements. So this is a particularly tangible and vicious site of state repression. And for me, the fact that activists working to protect and defend vulnerable ecosystems and non-humans have been targeted by the state as eco-terrorists and imprisoned suggests to radical movements that embracing and reinforcing state power may be counterproductive to efforts to improve and secure environmental justice. So just to conclude, I would say, returning to the story of Bryant Arroyo, if he could shut down a coal gasification plant from within the belly of the carceral beast that is the U.S. prison industrial complex, uplifting himself and 900 of his fellow inmates, changing the power dynamics between free and unfree, and securing a rather extraordinary victory from environmental justice from within the context of such violent captivity, then surely you and I and everyone else on this side of the prison walls in the so-called free world must have far greater power and promise and potential than we ever imagined, and can truly go much further toward creating new knowledge and transformative social change for environmental justice. Thank you.
Okay, sofa time. Julian, Alice. Great, well, that's given us a lot to think about. I'd like to start involving the audience in the conversation. It's good to have these three talking to each other, squashed up together as they are on that comfy sofa. But I'd like to also involve members of the audience in stimulating this conversation. I have things that I can ask them, but I'd like to open to the audience first of all. So what do you want them to talk about? So I don't want statements, I want questions, I want provocations to get people talking. So would anybody like to get us going? Yes, just okay. If you could say who you are just quickly to introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Willie. I'm from the University of South Pacific, Suva, Fiji. Thank you very much to the presenters for a very good discussion. I'm just giving a reflection and a question. I'm from the Pacific Islands, and I hardly hear of the word environmental justice. Every time, I think probably in the last 3 or 4 years, and every time I hear of the word environmental justice, it's always from the non-government organizations or the international non-government organizations or from the universities. So my question is, looking forward, probably in the next 20 years, I hope the next conference will not take 20 years to happen. What will be the future of the environmental justice? Because from my side of the world, it doesn't mean that I haven't heard of environmental justice, that we are not doing anything at all about environmental justice. Of course, we are doing a lot. But how can you frame it, environmental justice, looking forward, including partners like the government, private sector, and culture groups. Thank you.
Okay, so looking forward, how can environmental justice become more inclusive, more accessible, more meaningful to a greater range of social and economic actors? So let's get going. Alice.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think it's a very inclusive term in the sense of the ethos of the concept. So the idea of inequality, the idea of unjust burdens on poor and marginalized and ethnic minority communities. So I think that aspect and the injustice of it is what resonates. And I think in a way, it's a good idea to let go of the language if it doesn't do anything on the ground. And so that's what I've found in doing research in different contexts around the globe, is that there are very different, indigenous or local concepts that have more resonance but speak to similar issues. So I think there's sort of a difference between the ethos or the guiding, commonality, but not wanting to be too prescriptive about the kind of brand or the language.
Julian.
One thing I've noticed on campuses now, climate activism is really big, certainly in the US. The idea of trying to get universities to divest, as we in the 1970s tried to get universities in the UK to divest from Barclays Bank, which was a big South African supporter. The one thing that's really happened on campuses that has diversified the climate movement is the word justice. Now on campuses, they don't talk about climate change, they're talking about climate justice. And as soon as we began to frame it that way, some of the, what we call culture houses, the Asian American kids, the African American kids, the difference moved into the climate movement. So that's one example, I think, where this word justice has really opened up a space for a whole set of new discussions. It's not just the sustainability geeks on campus now, it's the African Americans, it's the Latinos, it's the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. But then, go back 10 years, and I used to be on a National Academies committee looking at the transmission of toxic waste to Yucca Mountain in the west of the United States. And we had several hearings, and at one hearing, we were up in, I think it was Nevada or something like that, and a cattle rancher comes up to me and he says, if that railway line comes anywhere near my ranch, that's a real environmental injustice, Julian, don't you think so? And I looked at him and I didn't know what to say. Here was a rancher enrolling concepts of environmental justice. So, to our friend, we have to be careful here. I mean, if everybody can use these concepts, are these concepts as powerful as they were when we initially thought of them? Final example, one of my first conferences on coming to the United States in '99, I said, and I thought quoting Bob Bullard would be good enough, that the environmental justice movement started when, the Warren, was it Warren?
County.
Warren County. I was thinking Warren Spring. Warren County event happened. And then a native person put up their hand and said, Julian, environmental injustice started when Columbus came here. So again, we have to think about our scales. We have to think about who's enrolling concepts of justice and injustice. It's not an answer, but we need to be asking questions about how we frame these concepts. But going forward, I think that we do have, certainly with young people today, we have a deep sense of injustice over climate. And I think that's one area that we really do need to focus on.
David.
Yeah, yes, I agree with everything that's been said. I would say, for me, this is a really relevant question also, because one of the, I think, most powerful and enduring contributions of environmental justice scholarship and activism has been precisely through the mode of inclusion and expansion and redefinition of what we even mean by these terms. So it's a very relevant question. I also want to be cautious, though, and to piggyback off what was just said, about sometimes we need to ask, what are we asking to be included in? And oftentimes there are violent modes of inclusion or inclusion into things that are inherently violent. And so I want to always respect when folks want to be autonomous and define situations for themselves. So when I was at a conference in Budapest one time, we were bringing together Americans with folks from Roma and Sinti communities, and they were asking us, can you define environmental justice for us? And Monique Harden, a colleague of Bob Bullard's and many of ours, said, you know, especially as an American, I want to be careful about trying to define your reality for you. So I'm going to turn the question back around to you and ask you, as a Roma person living in Central and Eastern Europe, how might you define environmental justice? And that elicited an extraordinarily generative response that had everything to do with health, with history, with culture, with 700 years of racism directed at these folks, something that most folks of color in the United States have no concept of in terms of that scale. There wasn't even a United States 300 years ago. So this was really fascinating to me. And finally, again, piggybacking on something that was said earlier, while this may be a term du jour, this concept and the idea and the struggle has been around arguably as long as humanity has been around. So I say I'm a big believer in autonomy and people defining this for themselves. So go forth and do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That was a great question and some nice responses. So we have a question there, and then can see two others in the audience. So let's keep everything nice and short. Okay.
Well, thanks for these very stimulating presentations. My name is Agyeman, and I work in KTH Environmental Humanities Lab in Stockholm, Sweden. My question is about the role of trade, international trade, in the future of environmental justice research, because starting from the metropolitan cities in the global north, all the way to cancer villages in China, and then back to Superfund sites in the US, I guess there's quite a bit of continuum in terms of global trade, also in connection with gold in Ghana and so on and so forth. So how do you see this future visions in terms of international trade and environmental justice relations? Thank you.
Thank you. So very much about interconnections and flows rather than just becoming too fixated on the local or on the particular situation. Because if geography tells you anything, and I am a geographer as well, it's that the world is interconnected and relational in many different ways. So, trade. Who'd like to take that up? David first this time?
So you two guys, you do more on this than me. You go first.
I don't know that I have anything coherent to say on that. Let me maybe dodge the question a bit by saying, you know, Naomi Klein once said to me in a group of folks when we were meeting with her a couple of months ago, she said, thinking about global trade, thinking about specifically its impact on climate change and this question of environmental justice, climate justice, food justice, oftentimes mainstream environmentalists will talk about that in terms of diversity and a box that needs to be checked. Let's focus on environmentalism, dealing with these issues, and then we'll bring in the indigenous peoples, people of color, and add that on. Klein's point, which is really the point that EJ scholars have been making from day one, Bob Bullard had done this since the early 80s, if not the 70s, is that this has to be at the core. And Naomi Klein's point was, if you look at some of the very first and most important subsidies and economic supports for colonialism, for what actually became this trade system that led to this Anthropocene, the Anthropocene, and has given us climate change, so some of the most important subsidies and economic supports that launched that system came from stolen lands and from stolen bodies. The enslavement of peoples, the dispossession of peoples worldwide. So this isn't a box to be checked. This isn't an add-on. This isn't a diversity issue mapped onto and imposed on to environmental issues. This is at the core of the issue. And this is why a number of historians, environmental historians, have said, yes, we can call this age the Anthropocene, the age of humans, the human dominance, but it might also be just as accurate to call this the long age of the plantation-ocene, because that, not just going back to hundreds of years ago and enslavement, but even today, the way that indentured and coerced labor of humans and non-humans are brought together to continue to mobilize financial trade markets and capitalism is really at the core. So that form of domination has been left fundamentally unchanged. So that's my response to what we need to see with global trade. We need to focus on the plantation and its continued reality, not just its legacy.
Well, and trade as well as not just in physical objects, but you know, one thing, I was talking about Maryland earlier, there are more Ghanaian doctors in Maryland than there are in Ghana. Trade in human intellectual resources is another part, I think, of this huge conundrum that you mentioned. And you know, as a person whose half of whose genome is from Ghana, I can feel for that country that is producing these great minds that are going elsewhere because the rewards are sweeter elsewhere. So let's remember that trade is not just in or the flow of goods, it's the flow of intellect and resources.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and I think that actually trade and the global economy is something that highlights some of the less visible and the more visible aspects of environmental justice and injustice. I actually got into the issue of environmental justice through research on ports. So looking at logistics, looking at you know, inequalities within port cities, and looking at global commodity chains, you know, how petrochemicals get around the world, and the invisibility of labor injustices on the sea. And I think that this is a really important issue. I mean, there's all this talk about how great solar panels are, how great electric cars are, but what about lithium and rare earth extraction? What about, I mean, a lot of the environmental justice struggles are around extractive industries, around different parts of the supply chain. So I think more attention actually to following commodity chains and following this very opaque and complex system is a very important structural question to shed light on issues of environmental justice.
Yeah, I'd agree completely. Look, I mean, logistics has never been exciting to me until quite recently, when people have really started to open up in a critical way some big questions about the logistics industry and all sorts of logics that run through it. Not now, no, because I want to include the people whose hands were up, who were just behind you. Okay.
Thanks. I was wondering about looking back at Nanjing, where Alice Ma's example there, Nanjing, that you know, perhaps the values of a society or a community are based around the means of production that form them. So in a place like Nanjing, where the means of production is a lot of, you know, it seems to be there's an awful lot of petrochemical plants there, that kind of changes the society so people don't protest. Would you, what sort of, what are your feelings about that?
We couldn't quite capture the question precisely. Was it about that?
Well, it's about the means of production. So like in Nanjing, petrochemical plants, and that forms, you know, a society's values, you know, generally. Capitalism has a system of values. Feudalism had a system of values. So how does that affect, whereas the people in Kunming, they weren't in the petrochemical town, they complained. So I'm just wondering whether that's an issue.
I think particularly it's about that notion of the company town and how caught up the people that live with those industries and are often very dependent on them, how they're sort of caught up in the system, in the means of production and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. It gets to the heart of a lot of the conflicts around values that I was talking about in relation to justice. Because at the end of the day, people need to, provide food and provide, money and sustain their households. And so, yeah, in the case of Nanjing and in the case of Foley and in many countries or where there are places that rely on I guess dirty industry for their livelihoods, then it's vital and people do protect that or want it, and it is a major constraint in terms of the possibilities for asking for anything different. So it does definitely constrain the possibilities for action.
Okay, we're running a bit tight, so I'm going to go for the last question and then give each of you a chance to say something to finish. Okay.
Hi, I'm Kim Berry. I'm an environmental editor with Thomson Reuters. I guess one of my question is, we're in a situation here in Australia where there's a longwall mining company up on the edge of the Blue Mountains. It wants to expand its production, which could negatively impact Sydney water catchment. There has been a lengthy process through the courts and through various planning agencies that have routinely come back and said, no, the risks outweigh the benefits. It supplies all of the water, it supplies all of the coal to a coal-fired power station nearby that supplies 15% of New South Wales energy. So it basically has reached an impasse. So the government just brought in legislation to let it go forward. So I guess my question is, when you're in a situation in a developed country where this sort of situation happens despite vast tracts of evidence and information about potential negative impacts, but you have a government that's willing to do that because fear and political expediency, where do you go? Same thing in Queensland with Adani. There's secrecy around that to a point of incredulity. Also the argument that comes with Adani that somehow we need to do it because it's our ethical duty to provide coal to India because that's helping them, develop as a country. So I guess when you're in a situation where we have all of this at our resources and within our psyche, and yet you still have governments not willing to move forward on any of it.
Okay.
What do you do?
Yeah, what do you do?
What are your thoughts?
Okay, I think that's a specific examples, but it's a good generic question which is going to endure, I think, in the future of environmental justice. So what are your thoughts about being in that type of situation? What tactics, what strategies, what means of making positive change can you quickly? Because I'm holding people back from coffee here, so quick solutions.
That's not a quick question. That's one of these horrible questions that panels really don't like. But you know what academics are really good at? We're equally good as to politicians at not answering the question, but saying what we want to say. So, you said, where do you go? Well, away. That's what you do. You go away. I'm looking at Nick Lowe. I'm thinking this is precisely the kind of question that he would love to have got. Because, we know that the state will...
Answer the question, Julian. Come on.
Yeah, I know. Gordon, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to talk and think of something to say.
Yes.
Where do you go? Hey, I don't know where you go on that one. I really don't. You've exhausted all your options. Community benefits agreements, no good. Go away, yeah, absolutely. Leave.
I mean, I would agree. I would say in communities that I've seen these sorts of things happen, you also want to be careful and mindful, of course, of local culture and local needs and desires and the ways that people have constructed the way their history has interfaced with mining as a way of life, whether we're talking in the United States, Appalachia, the Midwest, where many European American communities and other communities are saying, this has been our way of life, you outsiders are threatening us with all of your regulation, et cetera. But I also think of scale, and so if I'm working on a local campaign and I say, can we move beyond the local in terms of venue shopping, in terms of receptive audiences, in terms of decision makers, and in terms of receptive audiences, in terms of coalitions and partners, that is something I'm always down for. But on the global scale as well, as Julian said, if we lose this battle, we've still got the rest of the planet to fight for. And the other thing is, whether we're talking mines, dams, any other sorts of these locally unwanted land uses, it ain't over until it's over. We can go back, we can decommission these things, we can restore, we can rebuild, and we see that time and time again. So persistence, structures of abeyance, that is the sleeping giant of people who saw injustices decades ago, who want to come back and revisit issues, changing conditions. Never give up, never give up.
Thank you, Alice.
I don't know how I can follow that, but
We'll clap you as well, don't worry.
I think there's quite a tension between optimism and pessimism within this present moment and historically throughout the environmental justice movement. And I think there's often this kind of dominant discourse around capitalism or around greening capitalism of focusing on, the win-wins, or I've even heard the win-win-win, where all the different parties are the good stories, and these tough stories, which are actually a win-lose stories, like more of a story of structural injustice, of just inattention and being stuck. I think that those are the thorny issues that need to be addressed, and I think that's about changing the discourse and reaching it at a much more fundamental level. So I think that's the work that we need to do, and stay optimistic about the possibility rather than necessarily the probability. To echo Julian here.
Thank you very much to all three of our sofa sitters. I'm looking forward to more of this later on today and tomorrow morning and everything. So it's a great feature of the conference. So David, do you want to? Oh yeah, okay.